Hello my friends, Takuya here, and welcome back to another alternate history Hearts of Iron 4 video. Dear God, in the last video you all gave some interesting suggestions in the comments. So much so that I wasn't sure what was going to happen depending upon which answer actually won. Just as a reminder for those of you who are watching this here for the first time, if you want your suggestion to be a future alternate history video, make sure to go in the comment section right now and put your suggestion. And like whatever suggestions you all want, because we will take the top 5 most liked ones and we will put that into a poll here for the next time. I gotta say, I didn't actually know what was going to happen depending upon which option ended up winning. But luckily for me, which is something that I'm actually able to do much more effectively without learning a whole new mod, is what if Tsar Nicholas II never actually abdicated the Russian throne? I love this question because it's not just one alternate history question. In order for this to happen, there are so many things that actually have to take place. Which, on that note for context, we of course are then talking about the Great War Redux mod. One in which we get to play as the Russians, which is, of course, such a lovely, fun experience with Nicholas II here. The man with the glorious mustache and who simultaneously was quite hated because he was a bit of an inept autocrat. Yes, Emperor and autocrat of all the Russians, Moscow, Kiev, Vladimir, Novgorod, Tsar of Kazan, Tsar of Astrakhan, Tsar of Poland, Tsar of Siberia, Tsar of Chersontarian, Tsar of Georgia, Lord of Tsov, and Grand Prince of Smolensk, Lithuania, Volhynia, Podolia, Finland, Prince of and blah 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 blah. Oh dear God, there are so many freaking titles. You can see what it is that I am talking about here. Yes, my friends, you see in the end, it literally just goes through all these titles and then it just says, and others and others and others. Yes, he is the guy who is the ruler of many different things and heir to many other things. Holy crap, that is Russian monarchism as part of this. The last leader of the House of Romanov, the one whose entire family would end up being massacred after the rise of the Bolsheviks. Tsar Nicholas II is a guy who has a tragic story in and of itself. He was not exactly a great person, but he was an interesting person who had very complicated features about him. He was someone who both loved his country and wanted to take care of people, and simultaneously was an inept autocrat who would bully others and not listen to reason. He's a very complicated guy, as I said. Recent years have not been kind to the Russian Empire, with a major military defeat at the hands of Japan, which was back during the Russo-Japanese War, followed by a revolution that forced the once invisible Tsar, or invincible Tsar, into a constitution. The Russian government must get back on its feet and prove its strength again, or risk revolution. Luckily, the Balkans are turbulent again. The crumbling Ottoman Empire is Russia's opportunity to expand, create new puppet states, and more importantly, prove it is still a world power. Yes, my friends, we are going to be diving into the Russian Empire, and how exactly it is that Tsar Nicholas II could have potentially actually maintained power, something in which he would first lose in 1917. Subsequently afterwards, he and his entire family would end up being killed. Russia itself is a massive but truly backwards state. It is something that was humiliated at Tsushima. It is an agrarian empire which has very little capacity, or rather, I shouldn't say capacity. It has little industry with capacity for quite a bit, as it is a sleeping giant, a constant threat of revolution that could destabilize things, and of course, there are massive numbers of strikes throughout the country that further create greater instability and production issues. It's not exactly the most stable of places, and now we're going to have to explain how exactly it is that he could have not potentially abdicated from the throne. So here we are, my friends, at the beginning of 1910, and here we are with Mother Russia, giant superstate that we are. Oh dear God, how many units do we even have? 119. Yes, here's the thing that we need to understand from the very get-go. Russia had significantly more men than the German states. If you want to look at the Eastern Front over the course of World War I, between Germany and Austria, they together had like, what, 1.1, 1.2? Just over 1 million men that were on the Eastern Front. The Russians, in the meanwhile, had like 2 million. They had over double the numbers. The problem is that their weapons were oftentimes significantly more outdated, and simultaneously their factory production was astronomically weaker going into the conflict, along with horrible morale, horrible leadership, and just about every other regard that you could have was worse off. They just had more men. In fact, over the course of the Eastern Front in World War I, it wasn't even the German Empire that was doing the biggest amount of fighting in the East. It was the Austro-Hungarians that were largely the ones fighting against the Russians. The early days of that war went, rather poorly for the Russians. They suffered defeat after defeat after defeat, and yes, they did end up winning some victories, but the defeats that they suffered were so demoralizing, losing tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of men at a time, that it reached a point where the people were very angry on top of the other issues that Russia already had in this time period. So when it comes to the question of our man here, Nicholas II, and whether or not he will abdicate the throne, we're gonna need to look at that timeline here in the first place for what happened in our own timeline. After the defeats that I talked about that Russia already suffered, Nicholas would end up taking direct control of the military in 1915. This would end up being a bit of a double-edged sword. Because on one hand, the entire purpose of him taking control of the military was to inspire the men and increase morale. Of course, a leader who leads from the front, from the literal front, is someone who can be inspiring, but simultaneously, this did two very negative things. The Russians would continue to lose more of their battles than they would win, and simultaneously, there was already a lot of domestic problems back in, the capital in St. Petersburg that Nicholas was not able to deal with while it was that he was on the front. So as time was going on and these domestic issues were getting worse, every single defeat, every single failure, every single horrible thing that was happening on the military side ended up being attributed not to the military leaders of Russia, but Nicholas himself, because he was the guy who is leading it all. So rather than help morale, this ended up hurting morale severely. Eventually, by the time that it reached 1917, the people of Russia could not take it anymore, and the Duma, which if we go over here to this part, yes, convened the Fourth State Duma, which is historically what would happen in our own timeline, which this essentially was a governing body or Congress, you could almost say. This would eventually issue an ultimatum to the Tsar, telling him that he needed to abdicate, and with no political capital whatsoever, with no one on his side, with the entire countryside against him, Nicholas would accept this, and he would abdicate. The idea in here of Nicholas refusing to abdicate when he has literally no political capital whatsoever doesn't make sense. It's not going to happen. If it reaches by the point of 1917 that they are demanding that he is going to resign, he will have to. So that means in order for this to work in our alternate history timeline that we are building, we have to make it so that that never transpires in the first place. And that means Russia is going to have to do better in World War I. Or if it only does a little bit better, that he doesn't actually leave to take control of the military in the first place. So starting off here then from 1910, when it is that we have to look at things from the beginning, the first step in our historical piece of the puzzle is 20 years of peace. It is said that with 20 years of peace, Russia would be unrecognizable in its modernity. Let us prove this statement right. A time of tranquility will allow us to focus our efforts on improving our infrastructure, economy, and technology. Only in peace can we truly build a stronger, more advanced Mother Russia. Yes, despite its overwhelming population and potential, Russia was a very backward state, and any kind of conflict with a more advanced power would potentially bring ruin to that, much in the same way as their competition against Japan, after it had rapidly modernized itself, would end horribly with the Russo-Japanese War. To that end, in this timeline, we're going to say that Russia is going to try to do everything itself in order to increase and develop itself internally. The majority of technology that Russia was even getting in the first place in this time period was, of course, not of Russian innovation. It was specifically coming from outside sources and industrial powers that have been investing in Russia over the years in order for it to develop itself. Thus, we will say from the very get-go that that is what is being done. Early machine tools, construction, resource excavation, all of this needs to be done. To that end, we will not be changing Russian industry. We will not be giving them additional factories. We will not be giving them anything else. Realistically, it just wouldn't make sense during that time, but we will say that Russia heavily focused on its own industry during that time. With its own horribly backwards navy, there's very limited options for what exactly they will be able to do in that regard. What we can say is that Russia invested much more of its military resources, or rather its economic resources, in developing its heavy industry. And hopefully this would reflect well in the coming conflict, as if I remember the statistic correct, it was estimated that they needed around 100,000 new guns per month in order to be able to equip their troops and replace losses, but at max they were making like 48,000, which is not good. It reached a point that many of the new recruits that were being sent into battle literally did not have guns. They were expected to pick up a rifle off of one of their fallen comrades and use that instead. So no, not good. It doesn't matter if they have double the amount of men if half of them do not have rifles in the first place. Oh, great, Russia. I love your divisions. Thank you so much for your innovation here. I will call you the block division because that's pretty much all that you'll be able to do is block bullets with your bodies. As time goes on, Russia is going to have to face a variety of things, such as a lot of terrorist sabotage. Marxist revolutionaries have conducted a terrorist attack on local factory administration in a Russian province. The damage dealt is very visible. These terrorist attacks display a clear weakness in our great nation and signal something terrible coming. We must act fast. We must not show vulnerability or these attacks must stop. The big thing that we'll have to say in this time, in order to make Russia stronger, is that it's going to have to be able to deal with these kind of terrorist attacks, with these Marxist revolutionaries, better than they did in our own timeline. Yes, that still means that they're going to have brutal crackdowns, which are going to anger the population, but simultaneously we can say that maybe they were a bit more effective. They caught more of the ringleaders, that they maybe didn't hurt as many innocents in the first place as they did in our own timeline. Maybe it requires more effort by the government, but simultaneously you won't see an increase nearly as much of socialism. After 20 years of peace, the next step on here historically is the Navy Recovery Committee. In line with the 10-year Navy plan, the Navy Recovery Committee is tasked with revitalizing and expanding our naval capabilities. This committee will oversee the modernization of our fleet, ensuring that the Russian Navy regains its stature and prowess on the high seas. Yes, this is true. This is true. But what we will say in here is that instead of focusing on trying to rebuild the Navy immediately after such losses of what had been seen from, of course, the Russo-Japanese War, that Russia instead would focus on a little bit more of its agrarian, agricultural, and simultaneously its mechanical needs for heavy industry. They will still focus on the Navy, but it's a matter of priorities of what comes first. To that end, from the beginning, Russia would launch a program of national entrepreneurship and simultaneously machine building associations. It truly is ironic because the rapid industrialization that would take place in Russia during this time, prior to the revolution and everything else, is one of the things that would put so many people into the very crowded cities, which in turn would actually lead to a lot of the problems of, the proletariat developing. The ideas of Bolshevism is something that would spread from this with so many people being crowded into such conditions. We will say that Russia did this earlier, and perhaps simultaneously, they adopted somewhat more progressive reforms. We will say in this that there were perhaps more negotiations that were made specifically with strikers, that conditions were maybe a little bit better, that in doing so, maybe progress was slightly slower to develop, but simultaneously, the population went on strike less, which in turn actually aided production quotas. Because instead of not working for 2 or 3 months, they were working that whole time, if at a slightly slower breakneck pace. Yes, national entrepreneurship. The future of our nation lies in the hands of not just our workers, but our entrepreneurs as well. Encouraging entrepreneurship at a national level will boost our economy, foster innovation, and ultimately lead to the strengthening of our empire. At the same time, what we will say is that the Russian Empire would focus on solidifying its control in this time, that more forces of the army would be sent in to clear out dissidents, but simultaneously more efforts would be done to reform things, slightly. And it is with these economic efforts in place then that finally Russia would go and convene the Duma, just as they did in our own timeline. You have the option over here that you can go down an alternate path in which Alexander goes and resists the Duma and tries to take direct control of the country, but that in and of itself is going to result in significantly more problems. This is the path of a significantly more aggressive Russia, something that you actually theoretically could do. This is something that could happen. But for the purpose of our argument, we will not say that he tried to take direct control from the beginning. We will say that he goes down the historical timeline, but we need to build this in a way that is realistic. And that is with the Duma. With the need of our political stability and reform, we must convene the Fourth State Duma. This assembly will bring together representatives from across the empire, aiming to address the pressing issues of governance and national unity. It is a step towards balancing the diverse interests within our vast nation. Yes, we are starting preparations for the election of the Duma. The government's goal is to weaken the Republican opposition without provoking a political crisis. The Russian government will not survive the next revolution. No, it will not. But do not allow the left wing to win. In doing this, you have the option of having revolutionaries in the Duma or going with the centrist Duma, which is the historical timeline that is, real. And that is what it is that we are going to do. Now, our task is to maintain our balance of political force in the Duma, loyal to the Prime Minister and Tsar. If the constitutionalists get some support, the government can finally implement constitutional reforms. With the completion of the centrist Duma, this gives us several options. We can draft a constitution, we can raid Marxist printing houses, which, yes, it hurts our stability, but it also affects socialism, which is good. Organize a royal visit, and essentially much, much more as time goes on. Marxism is a problem, and it is something that is increasing thanks to strikes, but we will need to address that as time goes on. To that end, if the Tsar during this time had engaged more with domestic politics and hadn't retreated from things as much as he did in our own timeline, perhaps things would have then been better. Tsar Nicholas II was not a popular monarch. He was not actually popular until World War I began, in which the entire country was swept up into patriotic fervor. Of course, if he had been a bit smarter in our own timeline and actually worked with the government and worked with the people, perhaps then he would not have been nearly as so hated and would have been able to do things more rapidly. To that end, we will say that he organizes a variety of royal visits and goes around visiting the country. While this is happening, Russia would launch St. Petersburg's military exhibition. The St. Petersburg military exhibition will showcase the might and modernization of Russian military. This grand event will not only demonstrate our advancements in military technology, but also serve as a platform for fostering national pride and military spirits. It is only after doing these things that Russia would begin to focus on its navy again. It will do some aspects, but primarily it's going to be focusing on its own central industrialization efforts rather than the navy. This is something that will be done, but the attention would be arguably less split, with much emphasis on this navy being placed on the Baltic fleet rather than what we would see with the Black Sea fleet. If we were doing something along the lines of focusing on the Ottoman Empire from the alternate history path of resisting the Duma and taking authoritarian control, which in and of itself would be a fascinating alternate history what if, no, in this going along the historical line, the Baltic fleet would need to be prioritized. The Baltic Fleet in the west should be our main force of naval expansion, as it is our gateway to the wide Atlantic Ocean. If we are to ever fight a naval war in Europe, it will be the Baltic Fleet that will be the most important front, and as such, we will strengthen the Baltic Fleet to meet expectations. Of course, that brings into question what exactly is going to happen when it comes to international relations. You have the option of rapprochement with the Kaiser, or of unity with the Entente, and of course, what we're going to be doing, just as in our own historical timeline, is unity with the Entente. To keep the German threat at bay, we must strengthen ties with our Entente brothers. Improving our relations with France will be a major step in establishing our political position in Europe. We could make the argument from all of this, honestly, that Russia itself would not actually side with the Entente, that they would align themselves more with the Central Powers, and that in doing so, in seeking peace on their borders, that from here, Russia is able to get its 20 years of peace and nothing ever happens with the Kaiser. Yeah, we could literally just end the video right there and go with that argument, but no, we're going to have to continue this to show something actually happening. What if Russia had sided with the Central Powers in World War I? You know, it could have actually happened. Theoretically, it could have. The big thing, though, is that through efforts of simultaneously reform and crackdowns, that Russia eventually would crush the strike movement. That is the goal. The growing strike movement threatens the stability of our nation. We must take decisive action to quell these disturbances, ensuring the maintenance of order and the continuation of industrial productivity, essential for our nation's growth and security. Yeah, this is the really big problem that Russia had, is that even leading right up until World War I, in 1914, there was a series of horrible strikes that basically broke all industrial capacity that Russia had at the time. They just didn't have anything being produced when war actually started, until war then started and people went back to work in order to support the war itself. At the same time, an ultimatum would be delivered to Persia. For a long time, Persia has ravaged by a constitutional revolution, which also has been detrimental to our business interests and threatened the lives of our citizens in Persia. Some time ago, constitutionalists appointed several American advisors to run the Persian economy, which also undermines our influence, and it has been concluded that it's time to restore peace in Persia, which in turn brings us to a border war. After which, in rapid order, Tuva would be seized. The resource-rich region of Tuva, which had been broken free from Qing control during the 1911 revolution, presents a unique opportunity for Russia. By asserting control over Tuva, Russia can secure not only valuable natural resources, but also strengthen its position in Central Asia, a chessboard of power reminiscent of the Great Game. Russians at the gate of Tehran. Russian troops defeated the Persian forces and immediately put forward their demands on the Persian government. They demanded to immediately stop the oppression of Russian citizens and guaranteed the security of the expeditionary forces that will pass through the northern cities of Persia. In response to the intervention, constitutionalist forces rose up in Tabriz, but due to the lack of proper military command, were swiftly defeated by Russian forces. Many revolutionaries were executed. Yes, this would be a big power move and in turn strengthen the hold of the Russian state. The next step on here historically has to do with our economy. What to do about our partnership, the Wolgau Trading House or the Nobel Partnership? Well, the Nobel family, famed for its expertise in oil and explosives, could prove a valuable asset to our strategic ambition. Partnership with them can help us unlock the full potential of our natural resources and fuel our march towards a modern Russia. Yes, indeed. And it is then after all this is done, as resources are being extracted, that Russia would largely turn towards rearming its military. It's been clear for a while that our weaponry is not on par with those of our potential adversaries. With the realization that modern warfare relies heavily on the technology utilized, it's time for the Imperial Army to modernize its arsenal. Our brave soldiers deserve nothing but the best. Funny thing is, when we talk about this, the guns of Russia during this time were, they were not as good as the counterparts of what you would see with Germany and Austria, to be sure. But artillery-wise, they were kind of on par. Like, the thing is, they had about the same amount of artillery going into the conflict as, Germany and Austria did. It's just that they couldn't really utilize a lot of it or resupply a lot of it as time went on. And naturally, military factories would be developed. The Tula Arms plant has been the backbone of the Russian military might for over 2 centuries. It is now time to increase its capacity and modernize its production lines. New innovative firearm design should come out of this historical industrial giant. And we will say, through again a series of reforms as well as well-placed crackdowns, that the number of strikes that take place in Russia, though they're not going to entirely go away, they still do dissipate somewhat. They're not as effective. If we can reduce the effectiveness of strikes by maybe half, this still means that the industrial output of Russia during this time is going to be drastically greater than it was in our own timeline, allowing for more military production. After the Tula Arm plant comes the Kazan powder factory, and yes, this is something that we will say that there was more time, effort, and everything that was put into Russia from the beginning to get all of its goods underway. The interesting thing to bring up at this point here is that it's 1912, and it's actually in 1912 that, historically what ends up happening is you have the 1st Aviation Squad, and then the Russian Imperial Air Fleet, and then all these other developments that are put in. It is at this point in this year that Russia would go and actually found its first aviation schools, its developments to try and actually produce aircraft. They wouldn't necessarily be good aircraft, mind you, but it was their first foray into try and develop this, and that's why actually, if you go along the historical timeline for whatever reason, instead of developing their industry, yeah, Russia is going to build up this aviation, and that's what we kind of have to do right now. Support the Balkan League. The stronger the Balkan League, the longer that this fragile alliance will last. We need to provide the Serbs with armed support to make it easier for them to resist the Turks. Absolutely. Russia would, of course, gladly support the Turks. Not the Turks. What am I saying? The Turks. It would support the Balkan entities in this time because specifically they were in competition against the Ottoman Turks, and the desire for Constantinople and the reclaiming of the glory of the Orthodox past was a very real thing at this time. In fact, what's so crazy when we talk about all this stuff with aviation is that, technically speaking, at the beginning of World War I, Russia actually had the largest aviation, not industry, what is the term? Air fleet. Yeah, air fleet. It had the largest air fleet of the entire Entente. In second place was France. So yeah, Russia actually did put quite a bit of effort into Air Force, and that is something that will actually kind of fall through with. Air Forces are remarkably useful at this time. We'll perhaps say that maybe they developed better aces, that they were able to control more of the air on the Eastern Front. As 1913 develops, Russia would of course tie itself more and more closely to the Entente. It would accept British capital, it would develop stuff for its navy, for its army, for everything, and we can say that in this new timeline that it is in a better state than it was in our own. It is a bit more stable, there are less strikes, more reforms have taken place, that for whatever reason, Nicholas II is maybe actually a little bit more competent here. And on top of that, there's another crucial change that is going to be made. Rail systems. One of the big things that ended up happening on the Eastern Front in World War I is that in the years leading up to the war, right, what Russia had done, fearing that a war was going to break out with Germany, which it did, it went and destroyed much of its rail lines that head to Germany. With the idea of it being is that they didn't want these rails to be used against them. That's why you see the rail lines being just so freaking horrible over on this side. We are going to say that they didn't do that, or that they didn't do it to the degree that they did, which means that Russian troops were not going to face nearly as many supply issues going into the war as they did in our own time. And on that note, I'm actually going to have to be developing these up a little bit. Russian stance on the Balkan War. The Ottomans have declared war on Bulgaria, which is waging war against their former allies in order to regain territory lost in the First Balkan War. The return of the Ottomans to the Balkans would threaten our interests, and we will send in the navy to protest this. Of course, that's not exactly going to matter since Bulgaria is still going to lose absolutely horribly. Yeah. That'd be its own fascinating alternate history what if. Because after all, Russia is the guardian of orthodoxy. Tension is simmering over the Balkans. As Austria-Hungary and the Ottomans scheme for its hegemony, we must let it be known that when things come to cross the line, the Russian Empire will not hesitate in defending our Orthodox brothers. We can make from this kind of argument here is that Nicholas II posed himself as a more international figure, that he specifically accepted this guardian title of orthodoxy and perhaps participated more in the varying different things that would put Russia at the forefront of that. The population could have then been in greater support of him. But it is here, my friends, then entering into 1914, that things become significantly more chaotic, we will say. A series of things are going to happen in this time. The Russification of non-titular nations. To strengthen national unity, we embark on a policy of Russification, aiming to integrate the diverse ethnicities within our empire, and the policy seeks to promote Russian language, culture, and political ideals among the non-titular nations, solidifying the empire's cohesion. This could have actually been remarkably effective if it is something that had taken place over a period of 20 years of peace, instead of the revolutionary period that will follow. As time stands, well, yeah, we'll see how that actually plays out. Because Russia is going to do this, and then afterwards focus on artillery. Subsequently which, after that, we are going to see war more than likely break out. But prior to that, there is one thing that we will say actually did happen, and we're going to need to make this argument for the sake of things actually, well, working. From the start of the conflict, Russia is faced with a number of things. The threat of revolution is indeed bad. As the stronger this gets, the weaker our army is overall. What we will say is that prior to the war breaking out, or maybe in the very earliest stages of the war, there would be a series of reforms that would take place. A volunteer army for Russia would be accepted, the army would become significantly more professionalized, and this would actually work. We will say, just as in our own timeline, that in the outbreak of war, a series of patriotic fervor would upsweep across the country. And it did. Even when conscription took place, 95% of people are reported as actually having showed up when called, in comparison to what you would see in previous years. Thus, Russia, from the beginning of the war, has an army that is slightly better trained. It is most certainly better equipped and supplied than it was in our own timeline. So instead, maybe, half of all the troops not having a gun, it's only like 20% of it or something. But either way, the army and perhaps its military officers, after, tightening who is allowed to actually be in charge of things, is more controlled. As for what's going to happen regarding doctrine, there's several things that are key to Russia and its strength that we're going to have to utilize here. The first is that bold attack. This is something that would actually be a part of Russia's strategy over the course of World War I, is they would use deep battle doctrine and mass wave assault attacks to try and probe for any weaknesses. Yes, this would result in mass casualties, but simultaneously, you could most certainly say it was a bold attack. On that note, bayonet strength and use of infantry was necessary, especially as, oftentimes the soldiers didn't have bullets. So yes, we are going to need to use bayonet strength for this. And after that, well, logistical focus, we can say that things were a bit better in our timeline, but historically, realistically, more accurately, it's going to be operational reserves. Where there's one Russian man, there's probably 3 more. So you have it, my friends, then. Franz Ferdinand gets assassinated, Russia prepares to enter for some kind of conflict. Russia, at this point, has to prepare itself. The whole of Europe is about to heat up really fast. The July crisis begins towards Austria-Hungary as they claim Serbia. Yes, it's at this point here that Russia will begin to start mobilization. Europe prepares. Serbia naturally is going to refuse Austrian demands, and war, my friends, begins. As fighting begins all along the front line, it's going to take a moment for things to begin to solidify. The British attaché, the British have sent a military attaché. Yes, of course, absolutely, thank you very much. Supplies? Yes, send me all of the supplies. Russia is going to need as much help as it can possibly get during this time, as its industry is still not going to be great, but hopefully it is able to hold out to a much greater degree than it did in our own time. Russian losses on the front line are still expected to be horrible, but hopefully, with the fact that maybe every man actually has a rifle this time, the Germans are not able to make nearly as many moves into the countryside as they did in our own time. Of course, as this is going on, war is not going to be popular with everyone. An upsweeping fervor is going to seize the country as people are proud to be Russian once again, but the Marxists are still going to be there in the background. Marxists are spreading their vile ideas in the world revolution and socialism within the Russian army. They are demoralizing our troops and calling to turn bayonets against their commanders. We must not allow these wretched traitors to sabotage the war effort. No, indeed. It is here at the beginning of the war, even as Russia begins to push back in some places, that their victories can potentially be more numerous than their losses were in our time, or maybe they're even. The fighting is bloody, the fighting is brutal, hundreds of thousands of men would die, but perhaps the Russians would come out better than they did in our own time. As long as troops can be cycled through the front line, we shouldn't maintain too bad of losses, but I will actually still end up losing some men as time goes on. Naturally, that is going to happen as the Germans throw themselves at the front line. Though, historically, it would be actually the Austrians who would throw themselves at the front line. I can't make them fight me here, so to speak. As 1914 would head into 1950, the Russian army would learn quite a bit about what is going on here with warfare. They would experience quite a number of losses, many hundreds of thousands of men would likely perish or at least be wounded in combat, but they would be able to rack up a number of victories, and this would allow Nicholas, why I say Peter? I think it's St. Petersburg. Nicholas, he would not have to actually leave the palace, we will say. Instead, no, he would tinker with his own kind of armored vehicle, something that historically he did actually want to do. Despite performing better, of course, the Russians are still likely to be pushed back, at least to a degree. They may win more battles than they did in our own timeline, but it is still not going to be an easy process. Very painful, in fact. But as long as key supply points are able to be held, then things will go significantly better than they did in our own time. With greater sources of Russian supply, the men don't simply freeze and or starve to death as they did. With the development and acceptance of a volunteer army, Russia would devote significantly more of its time and energy into producing resources that are necessary for the Allies. Its industry is not fully underway, so it is being largely supplied through efforts, or rather guns and other things that are being given to them, but also what the Allies really need at this time is oil. They will need this in order to be able to sell and utilize to fund the war effort. In our own timeline, what happened is that the war was going so poorly by the time that, well, Russia was preparing to surrender, that ultimately they were printing money in order to be able to pay for things, which, as you can imagine, would only destabilize things further. If we can say that their industry was better in this time, then perhaps they won't actually suffer nearly as many economic shocks, especially if they don't lose a lot of their, territory and resources as the invading Austro-Hungarian and German forces move into the country. Following this, we have the Black Sea Raid. A group of Ottoman ships invaded the territorial waters of Crimea this morning. They opened fire on the bays of Sevastopol and Odessa, damaging and sinking several ships. Also, the Black Sea Fleet lost part of its oil reserves, and the Ottoman raiders blew up tanks in the port. This act of aggression means only one thing: the Ottoman Empire has entered the war. Yes, this is going to damage a number of the things that we have in here, and the Ottomans will fully enter on the war, which means that what would historically happen at this time in 1915 is that the Ottomans would end up launching a strike into the Caucasus in an effort to try and cut off Russian oil. That would ultimately fail, and what we will say in this new timeline is that not only did it fail, while it is that the Russians are able to hold most of the territory, losing bits and pieces as time goes on, and they are gradually ground on the east, but further south, they are able to even make counterattacks against the Ottomans. With this, Russia would become determined to protect the Western Armenians. Amidst the geopolitical chessboard of the Caucasus, safeguard Western Armenia emerges as a strategic imperative, symbolizing Russia's role as protector of Eastern Christians. It is here that Russia, with the victories that it would see on the battlefield, would specifically try to unite the population behind it, even as economically it suffers and is necessary to then support it from allied forces. What are our losses at this time? 231,000 versus, oh my god, almost 2 million, with me having caused the majority of it. Yep. The thing about this here is that an actual more competent Russia means that significantly more forces have to be sent to, of course, the east, which means that there's not going to be nearly as many pushes on the Western Front, and that and also in turn means that it's going to be way more bloody for the Central Powers. The bigger problem with Russia, though, is that as time goes on and as more men die on the front line, this simultaneously means that the economy of Russia is going to get weaker. It's not going to have nearly as much of an advanced thing in terms of factories, in terms of production. Its agriculture is going to weaken, which means that in order for things to be fixed, what we'll have to say is that agricultural reforms and mechanization needed to take place in this time in order to relieve that loss of manpower, that less men are able to do more work, which allows for more troops to be actually fed and fight on the front line. From 1915 heading into 1916, we will say that with the war going better, why do I keep on saying Peter? Nicholas never actually had to leave the capital. That with the domestic issues that Russia was facing, he never had to do this, which means that things were more under control. If theoretically, by going into 1916, that Russia was able to implement some degree of agrarian reform, then actually after that, it would have been significantly better for them. Less communist agitation, less pretty much everything. With the completion of agrarian reform, this means that Russia would actually be able to supply more of its men onto the front line with more resources, and from there could actually participate more in the war and do a variety of other things politically, such as unite Ruthenia. To the west lies the Carpathian Ruthenia, its folks suffering under the Austrian yoke. We shall crush the Habsburg menace and free your brethren, and the whole of Ruthenia shall rejoice. Yes, it is here that Russia would begin to politically try to unify a lot of the population, something that even with Marxist education and the horrible loss of life, which at this point we're at, what, 342,000 casualties? Yeah, that's a lot. And so now heading into 1916 with the opening of Romania into the war, which in our historical timeline had been quickly fairly conquered by Austria-Hungary, which opened up more of a front for Russia to have to deal with. This time, Austria-Hungary is not going to have nearly as many options after the heavy fighting in the east would have taken a great toll on both them and Germany, and this in turn would have allowed for the Russians and Romanians to potentially make a counterattack. And after all of our participation, it would make sense then that the Constantinople Agreement would take place. The centuries-old dream of control of Constantinople, the gateway between east and west, looms large. Securing this jewel would not only fulfill a historic ambition, but also reshape the balance of power in the region. Considering how much Russia would be contributing at this time, which at this point, if the war is more successful and things are going better, then yeah, Russia would actually have the overwhelming majority of war participation. Perhaps then, if Nicholas was even smarter, he would call for unity among the Polish people that are currently occupied by the Austrians as well as the Germans. In promising their autonomy and promising a degree of statehood for them, this in turn would allow for greater moves to be made in the West. Though it's not accurately reflected in this time, considering it's now November, we would say that it's at this time that we would actually see the Brusilov offensive. Just as it took place in our own timeline, it would happen here. Except instead of a counterattack in order to be able to try and take a lot of the territory that they were losing, the Brusilov offensive would be a grand attack after an enemy such as the Germans and the Austrians had been weakened after years of throwing themselves at the Russians, which, yes, it would grind down the Russians themselves, but the Russians would not be in nearly as poor of a position. The results of the Brusilov offensive, though they would gain some territory, would simultaneously, just as they were in our own timeline, not necessarily amount to much. This would create a lot of trouble and anger on the home front, as thousands, hundreds of thousands of Russians would probably die for this. The greater form of success, though, would likely be on the Ottoman Empire by this time. The Ottoman Empire heading into 1917 was in a very precarious state. They had managed to fight off the Entente forces for years, with the invasion of Gallipoli still failing. However, with the Russians actually being able to hold in the east, this means that more support is able to be sent into the Caucasus, allowing for a grand attack into the empire itself. Armenia and other forces that are located within this sphere would in turn likely rise up against the Ottomans, allowing the Russians to be able to make even greater gains. The result of this, after a series of pushes over the course of several months, would be that the Ottoman Empire itself would peace out of the war. Of course, simultaneously, this would be more than a white peace at this point, because the actual real negotiations would have to happen later. Still, their removal from the conflict in 1917 would be a huge boon for the Allies, as in our own timeline, they had actually lasted well into 1918 itself. With the end of the Ottomans, this means that going into the summer of 1917, a major offensive would be able to be launched from both the south and north, from Greece and Romania, potentially being able to drive Bulgaria out of the war itself. With the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, this potentially means 3, 4, maybe even 5 months later, Bulgaria itself would also collapse. The loss of this would in turn cause the Austro-Hungarian southern flank to potentially collapse, and that would greatly threaten the front lines, saving things for the east. Russia would potentially achieve a massive victory in the Balkans, which would in turn propel Nicholas's popularity, even again as hundreds of thousands of Russians die. Unfortunately, the big problem with Russia at this point is that it is still a very backward state, and as the pandemic would break out in 1917 and 1918, this would cause a lot of havoc along Russian lines. With forces that were significantly less sanitary and less prepared to actually deal with said issues, this means that they would probably suffer horrendous casualties from it. After years of war, stability as well as war support would falter, even with the Tsar not on the front line, but because of the victories, he is able to maintain control over the population. In a last-ditch effort, the Germans would likely make a great push to the east, which would end up driving out large numbers of Russian forces. Counterattacks would be made, but losses during this time would be horrendous. So it is then, my friends, that in 1918, perhaps even earlier than it would be in our own timeline, the Central Powers would be forced to give up. The problem at this point here is that with Russia not actually collapsing in this war, this means that the Germans and the Austrians would take significantly more casualties from that time. Or from that, if they were not able to push, if they instead decided to hold back and let the other powers try to fight or, take the fight to them, this still means that they would not be able to break through the blockade. Population would suffer, and eventually war support would drop to a point that the state would collapse. The Entente would win. In this, a series of things is going to happen with Russia. The Weimar Republic would of course naturally be formed. Communist agitation would be increasing over time in throughout Russia itself, but Tsar Nicholas II would manage to hold on to power. And with the Paris Peace Conference, everything is decided. The League of Nations is formed, the old empire of Russia still survives, Finland remains under the rule of Russia, millions would subsequently end up dying in varying different famines and other issues. But Russian power would remain supreme. Greece would get plenty of additional territory, except for Constantinople, which, like our deal stipulated, would actually end up going to Russia. Russia would take control of it and utilize this in order to be able to support its Greek Orthodox brothers. If anything, what is likely to happen in this time period is that the Megali idea is still going to continue. The Ottoman-Greek War, or rather the Turco-Greek War, is still going to take place, except in this case, well, it's going to be supported by the Russians. Not the Turks, the Greeks. The Greeks would likely end up working with both the Italians, the British, and also the Russians to be able to surround and destroy the Ottomans from all sides. Yes, the Russians would have suffered heavily, but with the support of the varying different Armenian groups and others that would now be supporting the Russian Empire, the Turks would be utterly eviscerated. Kemal Ataturk would never be able to rise. After the conflict, is there possibility that there is another revolution in Russia? Yes, there is. There is a decent chance that what ends up happening, rather than a communist effort, that more democratic ideals are sought, and that eventually, after this, the autocratic force of Russia is forced to adopt, which we are not going to see here in the game right now, but the idea of them maintaining absolute authority is not going to happen. There will be more trouble. Soldiers who fought and died for their country will want some kind of reward, and from that, we are going to see a more desire for a constitutionalist government. This would be followed by the Fifth State Duma, the first Russian constitution, and the ideas of pan-Slavism would have to take over. The question really comes here as to our promise with the Polish. Do the Russians go and release Poland, or is it that they clamp their foot down firmly? After the losses that took place in the conflict, Russia would probably not be in any position to be able to deny the Poles their promise, and as such, with no discord between Slavs, Poland would subsequently be released. With that, my friends, I think that we're going to end things here today. This was actually a fascinating one, and one that was really fun to go and create. If any of you out there have any ideas for what it is that we should do next, make sure to go ahead and like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know in the comment section below, and remember to like other comments because the top 5 most liked ones get turned into a video. I appreciate all you for watching. Thank you very much, and I'll see you here next time. Goodbye, my friends.